Hey guys, here is the episode that, man, it just felt like it was never going to happen. I had so many things that got in my way this week. Sick kid and lots of other things. And then today, I meant to get this done way earlier for you guys. And we actually, a lot of you know, we experienced a loss in our family on my husband's side. And we're really appreciative of any prayers that you guys have over healing for our family during this time. But I was able to finally get this episode done. So it does this kind of work just brings me so much joy because it's just such a reminder of God's constant provision for our lives, no matter what, and his constant hand on us. And I'm so appreciative of this story that can still bring me joy even when I am a little weary. So I hope it brings you guys joy too to hear the rest of Kirsti and Annika's story this week. Trigger warning, there are conversations of medical trauma, bullying, and educational abuse in this episode. Please protect your peace while listening. Previously on Spilling.
So looking back, I was probably really sheltered, but
Probably
it was okay.
in a lot of good ways.
My intent, my plan for my life was going to be married and have 3 children by the time I was 30. And I mean, I dated some, but I never really dated anybody super serious. I still, to this day, do not fully know why God did not allow me to get married, but it didn't happen. Turning 30 was much harder than turning 40. I think in some ways I just had to let go. Like it was a little depressing because what I had planned for my life was not happening at all. I remember I felt exhausted a lot because I felt like every time I went to anything, I had to be on. And it was like, could I meet him now? Yeah. It was like the pressure that I had put on myself. Yeah. It just felt like everywhere I turned, I was being faced with an adoption story. When the thought first started entering my mind, I'm like, there's no way I can do this. Seriously? This is really something that I could do? I just started praying about it and thinking about it. And I'm like, this is crazy. Can I really do this? I had to come to a point and say, okay, Lord, if I'm going to do this, I have to go into this with the assumption that I will never get married. I can't go into this expecting, okay, now that I've adopted, now you're going to bring him into my life. Because then I'm just going to be disappointed. It needs to be something that I feel like God wants me to do and that God's going to sustain us. I was really nervous to talk to him because I was like, what is he going to say? Because I know what the Bible says. I know the Bible says that the best, what God ordained, is a man and a wife for a family. And I fully understand that, but I really just felt like God was leading me this direction. So I met with Pastor Jim, and I barely got the words out of my mouth of, I'm thinking about adopting, where he leaned forward and was like, yes, you have to do this. It costs $50,000 to adopt, and I'm a single person with a single income. Yeah. And to this day, I still do not know how he provided all of that $50,000. I really don't know how it all came together, but it did. So by then, I knew I was at the top of the list. And that's how it works in Russia, is you're on a waiting list until you get to the top of the list. I got her referral in November.
Hi, Stacy.
Hi, Bailey.
Welcome back for part 2 of Kirsti and Annika's story. So again, if you didn't listen to part 1, now would be the time to stop and go listen to that right now. But we are just going to jump right back into where we left off. So at this point in our story, we are at where Annika and Kirsti are both divinely at the top of their lists at the same time. So Kirsti is on the top of the list to adopt a child out of Russia, and Annika is that child that is at the top of that list. And it took years to get this all in place. Kirsti waited for 2 or 3 years. And at the time that she got to the top of the list for adoption in Russia, a little girl named Mila, which is our Annika. So Annika, prior to adoption, her name was Mila. And I'll switch over to Annika's story in this. Annika, or Mila, was born and her mother kept her. So she was born and her mom kept her for about 4 months. Here's Annika.
I had a biological mom, and I know she loved me. I don't know much about her, but according to my mom, she had me, and she lived in an apartment for a while.
And we don't know what happened to Annika's biological mother. We don't know if she left on her own accord or if something happened to her. But when Annika was just a few months old,
she left without me and never came back.
Her mom left her in the apartment that they lived in, and she didn't come back. And no one really knows how long Annika was left in that apartment.
I have no idea how long she was in the apartment by herself. I assume it was a little bit because you wouldn't just call the police if you hear a baby cry a couple of times. But the neighbors had called the police because they heard a baby crying. And then when the police came and got her, they could not locate any relatives. They couldn't locate the biological mom, and there was no father on the birth certificate. So she went to a hospital for a month because there was literally no room for her in any of the orphanages around the area. And there's 5 orphanages in that area that she could have gone to. The orphanage that she did end up in a month later had 50 children, and they were birthed to 3 years old. So that kind of tells you how many little Russian children are in orphanages.
And so little Annika is in this orphanage, and I told you she's small. She was always small, very tiny. And the doctors at that point had diagnosed her with a critical diagnosis. This was in 2009. So Annika was born in 2009. So this is 2010. And Kirsti was at the top of the list right at the time, divinely at the time that Annika made it onto this list. In order to be placed up for adoption, you had to be in the orphanage for like 9 months or something, offered up to like Russian families before you could be placed for adoption outside of the country. And so that's why she was older at that point, because she was there since she was like 3 or 4 months old. But you think about it, in Russia, their healthcare system is way different, and all the Russian families saw on a chart with a child was medical history.
When I did receive her referral, she had some medical condition, and in Russia they had diagnosed her with pulmonary hypertension, which is fatal. And so I had given all of her medical information to a doctor here in the States that specializes in reading Russian medical documents, and he was referred to me through the agency that I was going through. And through his help and the adoption agency's help, I had requested additional medical documentation. And he said, based upon the test results, she did not have pulmonary hypertension. But he said, I can't conclusively say that she doesn't have this because they diagnosed her with it. Either the diagnosis is wrong or the tests are wrong. But he can't conclusively say. And so I had really no idea what I was going to do because she would not have survived a plane ride home if she did have that condition. So I knew for sure that she had a hole in her heart right near the valve.
And so they could see, oh, she has a hole in her heart too. But the pulmonary hypertension diagnosis, it didn't look good. And you're going to spend all this money to adopt a baby and they might die. And so Kirsti, she had to decide if she was going to adopt her or not. And she knew hole in her heart could be fatal. Like pulmonary hypertension is pretty severe, and that she might not even make it on the plane ride back to the United States. But she was just praying about it.
So I remember talking to a really good friend of mine at my parents' church that weekend. And she asked me the question. She said, do you feel like God is closing the door? And I said, oh, I don't really think so, because it's not conclusive. And she said, then I think you need to pray that he either slams that door shut or you tell him you're going to keep walking. So I did. I said, I'm going to keep walking. And I told the agency then on Monday that I would love to adopt her, and began the process of going over there for the first time.
And she decided she was going to keep walking down this path, and she wanted to adopt Annika.
The first time I went over there, I went with my brother. And when I saw her for the first time, she was 17 months old. And that was in December. And then at that time, during that trip, I began the paperwork and the process in Russia. And then I had to come back to the States. And then 3 months later, I went back to Russia for the actual court date.
And in this process, the doctors in Russia actually wanted to do open heart surgery on Annika to fix the hole in her heart at that time.
I really didn't know what to pray for Annika, because the first time I went over there, I only got to see her for like 2.5 hours total. But in January, the agency contacted me and said that Russia wanted to operate on Annika because she wasn't growing. And they assumed that it was because of her heart condition. And I remember I was in my office at work when I got that phone call, and I remember at that moment thinking, you are not going to operate on my child without me. And maybe other people that have adopted can feel this. It's like I'd only seen her for 2.5 hours, and then I had to leave. And I think a part of me didn't completely give her my heart. It was like I had to leave. I had to detach myself in some ways. But I just remember getting that phone call and thinking, no, that is my daughter. And so that was like the first time of that real, true connection. This is my daughter. So I was able to say, no, you're not going to do that, because I had started the process. So I am so thankful that they did not do that, because even when we got back to the States, the doctors here took her off of all of the medication that they had her on.
When they said they wanted to do open heart surgery on this baby, why she was in America still and this baby's in Russia, she was like, you're not doing surgery on my baby.
Right.
Like, that's my child.
Yes.
And that was the first moment that she's like, this is my child. And she's meant to be with me. And you're not doing surgery on her when I'm not there. And the doctors here just really didn't know that she needed it.
Right.
Yet. So she goes back a few months later, and she gets to take Annika with her.
How old was Annika whenever
I think she was 20 months old.
Okay.
20 months old when she went back. So they were separated for about 3 months.
Yes. Okay.
And I should mention.
Yeah, so in December, she came and saw me for the first time, and I saw a cross on her neck, and I put it in her mouth, and she spit it out. And it just became a really fun game. And she probably only had 2 hours to see me and hang out with me and get to know me, but mind you, I was a baby. So then that thing with the cross kind of just came a game for me and her to do. And then she comes back a few months later. They put me in her arms, and the first thing that I do is I put the cross in her mouth. And so it was like a thing of, hey, I remember you. I saw you a long time ago, and you had a cross, and I put it in your mouth.
I had no contact for 3 months. And so literally they put her back in my arms, and that was the very first thing that she did. And so for me at that moment, I was like, oh my goodness, you remember me. How at 20 months old do you remember your mom?
I said she was Mila before, and she got a new name when Kirsti got her because Kirsti had looked into a lot of things.
One of the things that I had read was the importance of renaming your child and giving them, it's like when God would rename people in the Bible, like when he renamed Saul to Paul, it's that the process of now you are mine. So that process of giving her a name. Yeah. And I had really struggled with how was I going to incorporate her biological name or what, but I chose Annika because it is Scandinavian, and my family is Scandinavian, and then her middle name is Rose, which is actually my parents' initials, and so she's the first and only grandchild to be named after my parents.
So she renamed her Annika, and so she's 20 months old, so she's little. And remember how tiny she is.
Yeah.
My given name was Mila, and it means little princess. And the ladies cried when I left, and they said, "You're taking our princess."
They were like, "You're taking our little princess," like they called her their little princess. And even though Annika had, in Russia, basically fatal medical conditions, which you just think of Russia as a much different place than here.
Annika was 20 months old, and she was 16 pounds, and her hair was turning gray from lack of nutrition. But they did cry when she left the orphanage because they really deeply loved her. And she was their little princess. And if you know Annika, you know that her personality draws you in right away. And so I am very thankful for the personality that God gave her because I think it protected her in the orphanage. I'm thankful for it for many reasons, but at the very beginning of her life, that personality and that ability to draw people in was what I think helped her bond with them, helped them care for her, because the fact that she was so little and basically malnourished is not because they didn't love her. It's just that's the best that they could care for her.
It's a different country.
And I can't imagine what she was like as a little girl or a baby, but even from a really young age, she just has this ability to connect with people and to just be so personal with people, even as this little toddler.
Yeah.
And so these women just loved her. And Kirsti believes that's part of probably why she survived with all of her medical conditions in Russia, is because she was able to connect with these women and they fell in love with her.
With all of them.
Yeah. And so they took the extra care that she probably needed in order to survive, which is really special. But that's just another piece of God's provision over her life. But God does have provision over Annika's life, and the enemy likes to try to stop these things from happening. Her brother went with her the first time when she met Annika, and then Brenda, her best friend, went with her when they went to adopt.
I spent a month in Russia, so I was in Russia from the middle of March to the middle of April, and that was a crazy month. It seemed like something went wrong almost every day that I was in Russia. That trip I went with a friend of mine, Aunt Brenda, and literally things like my credit card stopped working. I carried $10,000 of cash on me to Russia to pay for things. I ran completely out of cash. I had to have money wired. And the money was being spent on the expenses of the adoptions. One of my favorite stories is I had to have medical exams done for myself in Moscow, and then I had to go to the back alley and pay the gentleman at the Kremlin. He was my translator, and I had to pay the doctor, the lead doctor at the Kremlin clinic, and I had to pay him $800 in cash. So it was just, there was just a lot of things that I had to pay cash for that I ended up running out of cash. But there was just a lot of things. I wish I would have written down everything, but there were so many things that happened along the way that were like, you're kidding me, this obstacle? Not just the things that happened wrong every day in Russia. There were things with the paperwork. I'm surprised we even got there. Yeah. There were constant roadblocks, but God was faithful to take care of them.
As Kirsti was telling me her story and how difficult it was in Russia, like just everything going wrong constantly, I told her, the enemy didn't want her to be adopted. He didn't want her to end up in the United States. He didn't want her to end up being loved by you. God called Kirsti to that plan for a very specific purpose. And keeping Annika protected was part of that, and their paths aligning so that they were both at the top of those lists at the right time is so special. And then Kirsti said when they got back from Russia,
one of the things that I remember is when I got back here, I missed Russia. And I was like, how do I miss a place that was so challenging? I mean, it literally was. I remember one day Brenda said, oh my goodness, I don't think anything went bad today. I don't think something went wrong today, because it was just crazy. But I realized that it wasn't Russia that I missed. It was while I was in Russia, I couldn't do anything myself. I couldn't fix the problems. I was completely dependent upon God to take care of every detail, because I couldn't. And, as a single lady in her early 40s, I was used to taking care of things and doing things myself and fixing what needed to be fixed. And so to realize that was a really good lesson.
She knew she could not rely at all on herself. Like without God, she was completely hopeless over there and everything was going wrong. And in order to get Annika and be back here, everything had to be given up to God.
Yeah.
And in Russia, that was her only option. And so she had to be completely reliant on the Lord. Whereas here,
it's easy to fall back in.
It's easy to think we're good.
I can do it.
Yeah.
I can do it all.
Yeah. And so she realized that when she got back that, wow, like it's really good to be in full reliance on the Lord. It's really good to walk that path. And if you meet Kirsti, like you can just tell that she, to this day, recognizes that and tries to live that because it is a good way to walk, is fully reliant on God. But she had to give it all up to him to even make it. But they make it back, and Annika survives the plane ride, and they just start their life together.
So I ended up staying with Brenda. And during that time, my mom got cancer for the second time, only about a month or two at the most after Annika came home.
When Annika was just a baby, her mom got cancer again. But ultimately with Brenda, that was huge. That played out in a big way because we really needed the extra help with Annika because she would have to travel and help her mom.
Brenda and I would not be friends today had Brenda not become a Christian. I really believe that because our paths would have, she would have gone away. She left K-State a year before I did and went to Wisconsin. And I'm sure we would have never, had she not been a Christian, we wouldn't have had that connection. That I have 3 friends from high school, and we're still friends today. And we're still friends today because we're all Christians. I mean, I really believe that, we don't live in the same state anymore, you know? And I never would have imagined that God would have had Brenda and I work at the same college years later. That never would have crossed my mind. And so the fact that I was able to help take care of my mom and be there for my mom as a new mom, Brenda was able to help some. So I ended up taking my mom down to Tulane, and I would never have left Annika with just anybody, but I got to leave her at home. And so God took care of all of those details.
And she really thinks that a lot of that journey was God equipping her to fight for Annika.
Absolutely, yeah.
And to deal with all of the things that came across Annika's path.
10 years before that, my mom had breast cancer, and so I had helped her through that journey, and then she got cancer again and lived about a year and a half, almost 2 years with that cancer. And there was a lot of opportunity for me to care for my mom and to be there for my mom, which I think was also a way of God preparing me for the adventure that I would be on with Annika and the knowledge that I needed medically, because I do not like medical situations. They are not my favorite thing, but I learned to fight for my mom and also for my dad. My dad went through his share of medical stuff to only later know how to advocate for Annika medically. You have to fight for your kids, and you have to know how to fight for them medically.
Because it was not an easy journey at all.
I had taken my parents down to Tulane for my mom to have surgery because the cancer had spread. And so they were able to do some surgery down in Tulane. But I remember getting back from that trip with my parents, and Annika was sick again. And it was just colds that just didn't act like normal colds. But I'd taken her to the pediatrician again, and she wanted this test done to see if Annika had cystic fibrosis. And I just thought, no, this cannot happen. And thankfully, she did not have it. But looking back, that pediatrician knew that something was wrong. Mm-hmm. So then going forward, Children's Mercy ended up treating her for asthma. And we basically did that for a couple of years.
And her mom actually passed away when Annika was about 3. And that was another, for Kirsti, that was one of the hardest times for her, was losing her mom, because I mean, I can't imagine losing her mom. Only lived to be 69 years old. And she knows now, and I think she recognized in that process that God really did use her mom's medical journey to equip her, which is really special, but it's still hard to lose your mom. Yeah. And she was really glad that Annika got to meet her mom and dad. But it was hard. It was very hard for her to lose her mom at that age, right at the beginning of this process and having her own child. But she had Brenda. She had a friend there and that support. And I think that having that support was huge. And she had still those friends, those strong Christian friends that really helped support her and kept her through that. But from a very young age, Annika was very obviously God's child. We're all God's children, but Annika had a special connection with the Lord. And Kirsti obviously was strong in her faith, so they started going to church very early on. And Annika always just really gravitated towards praise and worship.
One of my fondest memories is she would go with me to church, into the service, and she would stand on the back of the pew and just dance and sing. And there was one time where we were visiting my parents, and she fell in the parking lot, and she was bleeding all over, and I was trying to clean her up in the bathroom, and she was hysterically crying, and I couldn't understand what she was saying. And finally I realized that she was saying that she wanted to go into church. So we went in, we sang, and then I could take her back out and clean her up. Because she didn't want to miss the singing. So from really from 20 months old, she loved the music. Yeah. And she would just stand there and sing and imitate the drummer in the back. There was one time where she was like flailing forward. I'm like, what are you doing? And I realized that she was imitating him. So she was aware of praise and worship songs.
Like just the singing and the songs. But she just loved praising God. And so from a really young age, she wanted to be baptized. And her mom believes that's an outward expression of internal heart change. And so she's like, gosh, she's so young. And every time she asked, it always just came down to Annika being like, because I love Jesus. I love him. And even at 4 years old, Aunt Brenda reading her a story and talking about angels.
Her aunt was reading the story of the angel appearing to Mary.
So my aunt was reading a story to me about an angel, and I look at her and I go, I saw an angel. And she looks at me and goes, what? Who was it? Jesus.
So when she said that, I was like, oh, wow, that was crazy. And then I realized, oh, my goodness. I had mentioned earlier, I didn't know how to pray for Annika during those 3 months that we were apart. But what I did consistently pray for was that she would know while we were apart that God was with her and that he was physically with her. And
maybe that was a sign.
I really do. I really believe that God was physically with her at times.
For sure.
Sure. And I have no doubt that she did see Jesus. I really believe that she did. Because at first I was like, oh, wow, that's crazy. And then when it just hit me, that's what I had been praying for. It was a real affirmation that he was truly with her.
And I asked Annika, I said, do you feel like you knew Jesus, like you knew God before you met your mom, before you came to the United States and went to church and all those things? And she said, yeah, I really do. Like she just recognized God's presence in her life. Maybe didn't have a name to put to it. But when Aunt Brenda at 4 years old, 4-year-old Annika was like, I've met an angel. And you can't tell me, as a spiritual person, you can't tell me that wasn't real. Like you can't, kids see God and have that childlike faith, and they recognize things that we don't recognize. And so Annika had a strong love for Jesus since a very young age. And she wanted to be baptized, but, you know, Kirsti was like, I really want to make sure this is legit. And so they would meet and talk to their youth and children's pastor at their church. Here's Pastor Mitch.
Annika, she doesn't know a stranger. I mean, she was just this little tiny petite girl with a bubbly personality that whenever she saw you, she ran up and gave you a hug from the first time she met you. But then she was always so inquisitive, just asking questions and wanting to learn about you, the person, which is unique for kids her age at the time because they're generally not concerned about details in your own and other people's lives. And so we got to become friends. In our first meeting, whenever I meet with kids that age, I'd always get down on the floor with them because you want to make the situation, you know, it's not an inquisition where we just want them to be able to articulate their faith best they can at their age. And there is no doubt that she loved God.
And at this point, remember, she still has a hole in her heart. So she has a hole in her heart. She had to go back and get her heart checked every 6 months. And by the time she was 5, they decided that she should probably go ahead and have this heart surgery because she wasn't growing. She was still really tiny. And it was just always something with her medically.
She wasn't growing. She had really stopped growing. And the heart doctor, her cardiologist, said, I think it's time that we do surgery because this is something that needs to be repaired so that it doesn't get worse and cause more problems because the hole was right near the valve. And a lot of times these holes repair themselves, but it was not repairing. It was not repairing itself. And he felt that with her not growing, it justified finally getting it fixed so that it didn't get worse.
Now we're at Annika having heart surgery. And at this point, she's older, so there's going to be less complications.
Yes.
So they did put it off. Thankfully, she didn't have it at 18 months old in Russia.
Yeah.
Because who knows if she would be here today. Thank the Lord for Kirsti stepping in and saying, no, she's not ready. And like I said, she did not have pulmonary hypertension. So that was a huge blessing. They thought she had that, but she didn't. So at 5, they go ahead and do this open heart surgery. And after they get home from the hospital, Annika suffers some complications.
Annika doesn't do anything medically normal. We left the hospital. She had open heart surgery on Tuesday, and we were discharged on Saturday. And then on Sunday, she is in excruciating pain, bawling, screaming, saying that her left arm hurt. And so finally, I got a hold of somebody at Children's Mercy. They said, you need to go to your hospital right away. Tell them to transport her immediately to us. And so when we get there to the hospital, she had just had a blue popsicle, and all they could talk about was your blue lips. Remember that? And
Did
then,
they think it was because
yes,
she wasn't breathing?
yes.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, no, it's a popsicle. And then an hour later, the doctor comes in. He goes, now, who was I supposed to call at Children's? I'm like, oh my goodness, just get us to Children's Mercy.
And so all the care team at this hospital could think she was not breathing. Like they thought she had blue lips
Oh my
because
goodness.
she wasn't getting, and they kept having to
Her
tell.
mouth was blue.
Yeah, they had to keep tell it's a popsicle. So finally, they get her back up to Children's Mercy.
By the time that Children's got there and got an IV started, they had a really hard time starting an IV because she was too dehydrated, I guess. So it was not pleasant to have to go back by any means. And what had happened is fluid had quickly built up around the heart in the sac that's around the heart. And we were there for another 6 days to try and get that drained. But it was that second trip is when we ran into the surgeon.
As much as they did not want to be back up at the hospital, we never know what seeds are planted during these times. And I think Annika is a good example of just living out that childlike faith and not being scared to talk about Jesus, because it was why they were back up at Children's Mercy, inpatient, that they would run back into their heart surgeon, who they should never have ran back into.
We should never have seen him. You have to understand this surgeon is the epitome of somebody that you would want with his hands on your daughter's heart. I mean, he came across as very calm, very focused, like nothing could unnerve him is how he came across.
Wasn't his name Peter?
It was. Good memory. See, you do remember. And so she said, "Excuse me."
Did you find Jesus in my heart?
And he goes, oh. I was like, she totally unnerved him. She totally caught him off guard. And I don't know if you remember his response, but his response was, "Well, it doesn't exactly work that way, but I'm sure he's in there somewhere." And it was a total God thing. It was totally divine that he was even up on the floor. One, we should not have been back there. And two, he should not have been up on the floor. And he was actually visiting another patient who we knew. So it was really cool.
And so Annika got to see her heart surgeon again. He responded with, I don't think that's really how it works, but I'm sure he's in there somewhere. And so actually leading up to that heart surgery, Annika and her mom had met with their youth pastor and talked to him about her getting baptized.
Whenever I would ask her why she wanted to be baptized, she would say, "Because I love Jesus." And I wanted her to truly have a relationship with Jesus and to understand that, because I believe that baptism is an outward sign of how God has changed your heart. So I would ask her questions, and it would always come back to, "I want to be baptized because I love Jesus." And so I talked to Pastor Mitch with Annika, and at the time he said, "Let's wait until she gets her heart fixed, and then we'll go from there."
There's no doubt that she knew all the answers to the questions and she really wanted this. But you also want to be sensitive to the parent and like, listen, let's just get through this heart surgery.
So Annika has her surgery, asks her cardiologist if Jesus is in her heart. I just want to go find this Dr. Peter who did this surgery and ask him if little Annika made an impression on him in looking for Jesus in people's hearts and maybe in his own, because I'm sure little Annika planted a seed in Dr. Peter that day. But she makes it back, and shortly after is Vacation Bible School, and Annika again tells Pastor Mitch that she wants to be baptized.
You went up to him again and said,
I get baptized.
And then Mitch said, "Annika, can you tell me what it means to be a Christian?" And Mitch later said to me, "She explained the entire gospel to me." He said, "She explained it all to me better than I could have."
I remember the VBS when she was like, "Hey, listen, the surgery's done. I'm fine. I'm ready." And it was at that moment where it's like, I remember telling her mom, "Listen, I can't think of a good reason to make her wait." And so in one of the conversations I had with them, and I have with all kids, is listen, at your age, you're not going to know everything you need to know about God, because none of us do. But just ask questions and just reassuring as Annika grows, just physically and spiritually, that she would have more questions about God. But there's no reason to hold her back right now, because there was only evidence that she knew what she was doing and knew what she wanted to do and why she wanted to do it.
And so Annika ends up getting baptized, and they get to talk about the cardiologist looking for Jesus in her heart and her reasoning for wanting to be baptized, and she gets baptized.
I remember when she did give her life to Christ, wanted to get baptized. It was just a precious moment, because it was one of these things where it wasn't an emotional decision. She was very thought through. She had a lot of questions and was able to really articulate her faith really well at a young age. And so it was fun just watching her grow up, and just how she really sought after God and just had a ton of questions about him.
Shortly after, she's probably about 6 at that time, and they fixed the hole in her heart, but she still isn't growing. So they start her on growth hormones to try to help her get bigger. So she's on those between age 6 and 11 years old. And as Kirsti says, there's just always something. There was always something with her medical journey.
She would get sick probably every 4 to 6 months. So that was ongoing. And I think because of being on the growth hormones, and we had the asthma doctor, and we were trying to figure that out. And then they found she was having some GI issues, and they found a spot on her kidneys. So then we started seeing the kidney doctor. And I don't exactly remember what year this was, but they thought that the mass had changed. So it was right before Christmas. They thought it was potentially cancer, and so they had to have additional testing, and thankfully it was not. But that is another doctor that we have to see on a regular basis to make sure that doesn't change.
It's just this road of just lots and lots of appointments, and she is always sick with something. There's always something going on. And through these years, she's getting sick constantly.
One of the things that kind of hit me one time is when I had told Annika that her cousin had the stomach bug, and she said to me, "Oh, is she in the hospital?" And it was at that point I was like, oh, everything medically that would happen to her, she was in the hospital.
And they treated her for asthma for a while, but that wasn't helping anything either. So finally they're like, I think this is something different, because she would get so sick with coughing. And I have kids with airway issues, and it's not easy.
I was also having coughing fits that were really bad.
Yeah. And you couldn't really explain at the time how scary they were. It wasn't, could you? She'd have to sit up in the recliner, and we tried everything, didn't we? And it was weird. Once I heard her start to sniffle, it got to the point where if I would hear her start to sniffle or cough a little bit, I knew what was ahead for the next 5 days or so, because I would just have to eventually take her in. And it was weird because I would call Children's Mercy nurse line. They'd hear her coughing. They would be like, well, you can't bring her here, because they didn't want me on the road and something, where she wouldn't be able to breathe. But we would get to the ER here, and I think that was probably part of why it's so long to eventually diagnose, because all these different people were seeing her. But in November of 18, I was like, this isn't right. We had been trying to get into a clinic that would talk to all the different offices, because by then we probably had 8 different specialists that we were working with. And from her heart to her kidneys to her GI to the asthma to pulmonology. And we got connected to a new asthma doctor. And she said, I really don't think that this is asthma. I really need you to go see this pulmonologist. And that was kind of my breaking point. And so we met with a new pulmonologist, Dr. Jade, and she agreed that it didn't sound like asthma. And she did a scope at the beginning of December of 18. From that scope, she was able to diagnose her with tracheobronchial malacia.
They find out she has tracheal bronchial malacia, which I have a child with bronchial malacia. So when Kirsti and I met at Bergfest, she started telling me about some of Annika's medical journeys, and we were like, let's connect right away, because we have a pulmonologist. We've been through a lot of these airway things, but tracheal bronchial malacia is where your trachea and your bronchi, they collapse. So they're floppy. So they're, instead of being more of a firm structure that's open for you to breathe, they collapse on themselves. And so Kirsti's dad had needed more medical attention as he got older. So he had actually moved to Warrensburg area in 2018.
In the meantime, that year in 18, we moved my dad in the fall. In October of 18, we moved my dad to Warrensburg because he was hospitalized in October of 18 and almost didn't live, but God gave him to us for another year, and we were able to move him here, and we were able to see him almost daily. So then in February of 19, she was obviously still getting sick. And by that point, she was wearing a vest every day that would shake her, and she was on all different meds and stuff. And Dr. Jade called me one day, and she said, I just need you to know what I know now. And I think she had just gotten back from a conference, because when she was first diagnosed Annika, she said that she would outgrow it. But when she called in February or March, she said, she's not going to outgrow this. And I really think that she would be a good candidate for Boston to take a look, for Children's in Boston to take a look at her. And I contacted them, and we went in August. And when we were in the clinic with him, he said, yeah, it sounds like she probably has a mild case of tracheobronchial. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, mild is great, but why are we here if it's mild?
Mild, sure.
Yeah, it wasn't. And so then in Boston, they have multiple people scoping at once. So they've realized in Boston that all of these things are connected. And the first doctor came out, and she's, yeah, it collapses in multiple places. And so then the doctor came out, and he explained that there were multiple places along her trachea and her bronchial tube that were collapsing at 100%. And they collapse when she would exhale with force. And so that's why when she would cough, everything would collapse, and then everything would stay in her lungs. And so by then she already had lung damage in the left lung.
So imagine a cough is a forced exhale. You're pushing a lot of air out when you cough. On forced exhale, her bronchi and trach are collapsing 100%. And so she already had suffered at this age lung damage due to this condition. But basically she gets on for this surgery where they're going to sew her airways to her spine to keep them open.
Wow.
To keep them from collapsing. Because if you have a child with airway disorders or anything, you know, when you're relaxed or laying down, they collapse even more. So Annika, for all these years, is not getting good sleep because she's constantly sick, and you can't lay down. You have to be upright and all these things. So they came up with this new procedure to sew these airways to her spinal cord, to her spinal column, to keep them open. So that's a major surgery. Kirsti's dad had moved to Warrensburg area in 2018. So Annika and Kirsti got to spend a lot more time with him during that time.
And then he passed away at the end of October. And then we went to Boston in November.
But he actually passed away in October of 2019. So between their first trip to Boston and going back in November for this surgery, Kirsti's dad died. And so again, really hard times for Kirsti. Yeah. And really for Kirsti, this is where we all experience questions and doubts in our faith. And for Kirsti, she's like, at this point, she's like, God, I've given you everything. And I put my faith and my trust in you, but you better be real. You know, this better all be real, because I want to see my parents again someday, you know? And here's her baby having all these extreme surgeries. I can't even imagine. But they go to Boston. She has a procedure, and it's successful.
And that surgery was even harder to recover from than the open heart surgery. It was really hard. You want to talk about that?
Because they put a tube, it was a drainage tube, and it went through my rib cage, and I don't know where it came out, but it was really painful to breathe or do anything. And once they ripped it out, I felt so good. I'm not going to lie. It felt amazing.
They sewed her trachea and her bronchial tubes to her spine. The surgeon that invented the surgery is the one that actually operated on her.
It's like a celebrity.
And you got this done before COVID?
I know. It was
Can you imagine?
completely God's timing. Yes. Thankfully, we were able to go. I mean, yes. And COVID would have looked very different, because literally every time that she got a cold, we were in the ER. And we just met with Dr. Jade a couple weeks ago. And one of the things that she laughs about is that Annika's oxygen saturation is above 100. Normal is above 100. It was...
I didn't even know that was possible.
Yes, which I think is, to me, it's one more example of the way that God protected Annika, because when she would get so sick, her levels wouldn't drop to the point where she was in danger. She was very sick, but she wasn't having to be hospitalized all the time. We were going to the ER, but she was able to recover. Explain why they said in Russia that she had pulmonary hypertension? Yeah. Because she wasn't breathing in Russia. So it really answered so many of the questions.
Annika was struggling in other areas, not just in her medical journey, but even in her education journey. In second grade, Annika was at a private school, and it's very much, I told her it just sounds like educational abuse, just very sad experience in school.
So when you walked in, it was just like this huge room, and there were 3 doors. It was first, second, third, and then there was a makeshift cafeteria on the right side of me, and then there was a cubby area in the back, and then there was a bathroom. The class that I was in, they started having us go into a teacher's room, and this teacher would yell at her students. Like, I could hear her from next door. So one day we started going over there to learn math, and I hated it. She yelled at me, and she wouldn't just yell at me, she would yell at other students. I have this very vivid memory. There was this boy, he was sitting in a chair, and he had one of those square base 10 blocks. And I don't remember what she was asking him, but she kept yelling at him. And he just kept saying, I don't know. And so then she just kept yelling at him. And then eventually she would start yelling at me when I didn't know the simple answer to 2 + 2, 3 × 4. So she would just yell at me over these things. And eventually it got to the point where she would grab me by my arm, like the way your mom grabs you when she's about to drag you out of the grocery store because you won't stop crying over getting that one toy that you eventually end up getting for Christmas. So she would drag me out of the room, and there was this big space, like I told you earlier, and there was a storage closet. And it wasn't like a tiny storage closet. It was a big closet, but it was supposedly where they put all the bad kids. And so if I didn't know a simple math question or something simple, she would just put me in that closet until I figured myself out.
And later, Annika would find out that she has something called dyscalculia, which is basically the math version of dyslexia. So dyscalculia is a learning disability. This is a definition from Google. Okay. Learning disability that affects a person's ability to understand and work with numbers and math. And so during these young years in elementary, she would suffer pretty much educational abuse in that if she didn't have the answer, she would be removed from the classroom. So she suffered in that area, not just from having an undiagnosed learning disability, but in this trauma now that's connected to that.
My mom was at a conference at that school or something, and the teacher was talking about how the child won't listen or something if they don't feel safe. And so that's the moment that my mom realized, oh my gosh, Annika's not safe in that class. She also found out that Miss was yelling at me because my mom was talking to this kid, and she says, does Miss yell? And she looks at her and goes, oh yeah, she yells at Annika all the time. And so that's how she found out. But ever since that, I've been growing, and I now have an amazing tutor. And so, yeah.
So she's struggled with, if a teacher calls on me and I don't know the answer, I'm either going to be made fun of or yelled at, or just that post-traumatic like stress response.
So that ended up becoming like a thing for me where anytime someone asked me a math question, I would just start panicking. I remember I was in 8th grade, and my teacher, we were doing this thing for books. I don't remember what it was, but he literally looked at me and went in front of the whole class, what's this divided by this, and I totally froze because the only thing that I knew is that if I didn't get it wrong, either I'm going to get yelled at or I'm going to get laughed at. And so that kind of made itself into a thing for if someone asks you a question, it's kind of a fight and flight mode.
Probably something with her medical and genetic condition, but also being in the orphanage, she was constantly in a state of flight. Like her body was just constantly in this stressed state. And what happens to us as babies and toddlers and stuff, really, like physically your body learns responses. Even if you don't remember anything or remember abuse or anything, your body has certain responses that it can take a lot of therapy to get rid of.
We did a lot of the integrating the cognitive reflexes and that kind of therapy to try and help, because her body was really in a constant state of fight. Yeah. And that's a thing that adopting her at 20 months old, you wouldn't think that, I mean, I've had people be like, she doesn't remember anything, but there's things that still carry on. I remember I was rocking her to bed one night. This is like one of the times that I feel like God like audibly spoke to me. It's not very often that I feel like, but I was just rocking her and she said that she was hungry. And I started, because we had done the whole bedtime routine. It was time to go to bed. It's not time to eat. And I started to say no. And it was like God said, no, you get up and you get this child food. So I did. And then for a couple months, she wanted food right next to her bed when she went to sleep. And then eventually, that was okay.
I'm still weird about food to this day.
And she told you her story of how she was left, and she still will. There'll be times where she'll be like, Mom, where are you in the house? She does not like being left. Yeah. Like, if it's a planned thing, but like, and so she doesn't remember being in the apartment by herself, but her brain does.
So she was in a lot of different therapies all through her life, trying to help with these things. And then you add in educational abuse and trauma. And she started to be more self-conscious about things. She talked to me about how she's been in like a special education math class. Mm-hmm. She's a great reader and writer and all these things, but like math, because of this dyscalculia, she is in special education math. And so she just, for the first time, I think the enemy's kind of trying to talk some self-conscious self-doubt into her, and she for the first time felt like she should have shame around that, being in a special education class.
For any of you people out there, I am in a class called, I've heard it called so many different things, a special needs education, student services, but so I'm in that class for math, and I don't know why, but for the longest time, and it was in 7th grade, and I was walking back from lunch, and something told me that I should be self-conscious of being in that class. And 6th grade, I had no problem with it. I walk in that class, no problem. But something just told me that I needed to start caring about being in that class. And so for my 7th and 8th grade year, I would hide in the bathrooms until the hallways cleared out so I could go to that room and no one would see me. Because I was, 1, too scared to be seen, and 2, to be made fun of.
That makes me so sad. But now that she's in high school, she says, math's all in the same hallway. So who really, she's just such a positive kid. Just so doesn't really, I mean, I know she's struggled with those things in the past, and I'm sure has her own struggles now, but she really just doesn't give a hoot. But her early years of her life were so big that she's known all along, I'm going somewhere. God kept me alive. Like she's known that from an early age. She knows God has a purpose for her. But that doesn't mean it's all easy. And that doesn't mean that having these medical battles or being 4'6" in 7th grade is easy, because it's not. And so she goes through a lot of this, and I told you she loved praise and worship. She loved singing from a very young age. Annika had doctors tell her, you shouldn't even be able to sing.
My doctors told me that with this thing, this bronchiomalacia thing that I have, I shouldn't be able to sing. I shouldn't be able to sing. I should be on oxygen in my mid-20s.
And that was part of why we started voice lessons years ago, was to strengthen her lungs.
And this little girl loved to sing, so she did. I think that's one of those beautiful gifts and such a joyful gift to have. And so Annika still uses that gift. Speaking of Annika singing, and going back to what I told you in the beginning of when I met Kirsti, and she said, it just seems like anytime Annika sings or performs or something supernatural happens. And Annika has had quite a few very interesting interactions.
Oh, yeah.
My first concert was, I don't know if y'all have heard of them, but they're called Newsboys. Search them up on Spotify. They're amazing.
I grew up on Newsboys, girl. We had all their CDs.
Michael Tate comes out and he starts talking about, if you adopt a kid, you get backstage passes. And all I heard was adopt a child backstage passes. And mind you, I'm like 5, maybe, can't remember.
I think you were like maybe 7.
Yeah,
maybe 7.
So I'm like crying to my mom, like, why can't we adopt a kid? She's probably over there thinking, because I already have you and I don't need another kid. But then if this guy comes over and says, here's my pass, gives us backstage passes, I go back there and meet him.
Really?
There's no photography allowed. And I sang with Michael Tate.
It happened exactly how Annika said. So she goes through the line and Michael Tate sees her. We don't know this man, but he starts hollering at her to come over and give him a hug. Like, it was funny, wasn't it? And so she walks over to him and you say to him,
someday I want to sing God's Not Dead with you. And he goes, let's do it right now. And we're literally this close to each other singing God's Not Dead, and there's no videos allowed.
oh, it's so
So the very first concert she ever went to, she ends up singing with Michael Tate. Told him like she's always wanted to sing like God's Not Dead is Michael Tate, like Newsboys, God's Not Dead, he's surely alive, he's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. I gotta have it in there a little bit.
Yes.
So she gets to sing God's Not Dead. 7-year-old Annika gets to sing God's Not Dead with Michael Tate.
Aww.
And then just a year later, when she's 8, her second concert ever, her mom like prepped her like, that's not going to happen at every concert. You're not going to get to sing.
You won't be caught up on stage.
Yeah, you're not going to get to sing with every singer that we go meet. But Kirsti did get her in on like a Q&A or something. So they get to meet Stephen Curtis Chapman and Plum.
It was Plum and Stephen Curtis Chapman. That was the order. And so I was talking to Stephen Curtis Chapman because back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the things that I think is kind of sad is there are very few Christian agencies that were willing to give me as a single person a grant. There's lots of grants out there for adoption, but Stephen Curtis Chapman's organization was the only one. Mm-hmm. Wow. So, and he has Show Hope, the Show Hope Foundation, that's named after one of his daughters. So I was talking to him in line because it was just a signing line, and thanking him and how much that meant to me. And all of a sudden, him and I both look over,
and I'm singing with Plum.
And she's singing with Plum. Wow. So then they finish, and Stephen Curtis Chapman
starts applauding.
She turns around, and Annika is singing with Plum just at this meet and greet. And they're just singing together, just like she just sang on the beginning of my recording. She just loved her, and so they just started singing one of her songs. So really special moment there. But again, she is still on growth hormones, and they eventually stop those by the time she's 11.
I am 4'8". I know it's so short. I'm 4'8", and I was not that tall in elementary school. Like, I wasn't tall. Like, I think probably 4'8" was the usual size for most second graders, and I was probably below that. I don't know how tall I was, but my mom started me on growth hormones, And I was supposed to get 5 foot, and then I was supposed to get 4'11", and now I'm here.
And they get to the point where they tell her that this is it, 4'8". So that was a low moment for Annika, was finding out, I'm not going to get any taller. This is it.
Yeah.
And she had struggled with this educational aspect of it. And now she's getting older and she finds out this is it for you.
And I was really sad because I really wanted to be tall and not have the pain of having to deal with being short. Being short comes with a lot of terrible things. People always ask me, do you want a kids menu? People are like, oh yeah, the kids section is like right down there. Oh yeah, the girls' jeans section is right down there. I'm 15, guys. And I think that's just a real struggle.
She just hates going into a restaurant. Do you want a kids menu? And then shopping at stores. Oh, the little girls section, And that's it is really hard, especially through your teen years. Every teenager, girl and boy, deals with some form of body image that you're trying to uphold, and you're growing into your body. But here Annika is, and she's not growing that well. And so she suffered with lots of different forms of just stress on herself, and she knew the Lord. She knew she had a purpose, which is the beautiful thing about Annika.
But it's also really nice because I think there's a reason that I'm this height. I don't know what the reason is, but I think that there's a reason that I am this height, and whatever reason it is, I'm sure that it's gonna show through one day or another.
But again, she, like her mom, is surrounded by a good youth group, strong Christian friends, her wonderful mother, and good leadership in her life to know that her purpose isn't always going to be just your height. It's not all about that. But she uses her gifts, and her mom has encouraged those gifts. And then flash forward to 2023. So about a year ago, Annika went to Winter Jam. So it's a big Christmas concert set up with is it for just youth?
I feel like it's at least for younger people.
Yeah, a lot of youth groups go to Winter Jam. It's like a collaborative concert with a bunch of Christian artists. And so it's at T-Mobile Center, which is I still call it Sprint Center, but she's there. And
at the beginning, there's a DJ and there's a pre-jam. That's just a bunch of bands that play music before the big artists come on. And so last year, the DJ was at his booth thingy, and he says into the mic, do I have any future singers out in the audience? Or is this something like that? So I ended up going down there with one of my best friends as moral support because I was scared, even though we've been on a stage like a bazillions of times. But this was T-Mobile. That place is big. It's got tons of people. So I went to the DJ. My friend was standing behind me, and he had me sing, and I sang, and people were hooping and hollering, and I felt like that was just a really good moment for me.
Everyone was vibing and clapping and hooting and hollering for her. And she said that was just really a moment for her of stepping out in faith and singing in front of all these people. But then flash forward to this year, again, her mom's like, you're not going to always get to sing with them, right?
And here she is every time.
They go to a We the Kingdom concert, okay? And We the Kingdom with Katie Nicole. And like I said, she sang this song for her Aunt Brenda at Bergfest just like a month ago, which is how I connected with her. Her Aunt Brenda was at this concert with her.
It only gets better because it was this year, actually. We went to a We the Kingdom, and Katie Nicole, again, if you've never heard of them, you need to listen to them. They are amazing. And I was with a We the Kingdom guy. I was talking to him because we did a Q&A, and Brenda was talking to Katie and said, yeah, your song really spoke to me because I was going through cancer at the time. And your song, God is in the Story, really was a song that I really liked when I was going through it. And my niece decided to sing that song for a concert, not knowing that that was the song that I've also picked to listen to. And a few minutes later, after we've been talking for a little bit, the lead guy for We the Kingdom, Ed, looks at me and goes, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but will you sing with Katie Nicole? And so I sang God is in the Story with Katie Nicole, and then afterwards, Ed and my mom were talking, and then I was talking to Andrew, and Ed gave my mom his email.
Annika got to sing God is in the Story with Katie Nicole. And he also, during the concert, she got like a signed hat or something from Katie Nicole. And then during the concert, Ed came down to her and had her sing with him.
Aww.
During the concert on the mic. And she says, I wasn't really singing, I was screaming and crying.
Oh.
But she got to have this wonderful experience. And so Annika's just very special. And the We the Kingdom guys like gave her mom their email. And her mom was telling me when I met her at Bergfest that she, you know, as her mom, she's like, is this really something like being a professional singer or something? Like, is this really something I should encourage her to pursue? And Ed told her that they all could just feel the anointing on Annika's life and just feel the Lord's presence when she sang. And so that was an encouragement to Kirsti, but I know that they were speaking truth to Kirsti, because if you ever are in the presence of Annika, you can just tell God has really big plans for her. I don't know what they are yet. Right. She's writing a book right now. She loves World War II and like history, but she's really interested in World War II. And so she's writing a book. It's a historical fiction.
I'm writing a book, and no, I'm not published. So don't go look up on Amazon. You're not going to find anything, sadly. So I started writing this book. I really started thinking about it in 5th grade because I suddenly got an interest in World War II. I decided to start with the story of a Nazi soldier named Jack. I know it's not German at all. It's fine. And he is in love with a Jewish girl named Hannah, and she is in a concentration camp. And after he gets injured on the front lines, he's sent to a concentration camp to work as a guard there. And he sees her there, and he just sees all this stuff, and it's just kind of his story. The reason I chose to write from his perspective is because I think that a lot of people think that Nazis are evil. And they are evil, but like I'm not like saying that they're not. There were some that were evil, but there were some that were genuinely good and didn't want to do what they were being told to do. There was a quote that I saw, and it was, I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm just doing what I'm told. I don't know where I read it, but I read it somewhere. And so I just decided to write it from the Nazis' perspective because I feel like you get the Jews' perspective, but you don't always get the soldiers' perspective.
It's like a 3-part book on like a Nazi soldier and a Jewish girl and kind of their story, and she's working on it. So I can't wait to see what she does with that. She's still singing and doing all these things. She sings for her youth choir, like her youth worship team at church. Yes. She's in a show choir, and she's just doing all the things.
Girl,
and
go on.
She's getting it done.
Yes.
And Kirsti's right there. And like I said, they're just the sweetest pair together, and they're so supportive of each other, and in such a they have such a very special bond, you can tell. But Kirsti's very open with Annika. They don't shy about any of these things. All these things we talk about are not super easy things to remember or talk about, but they've always just relied on the Lord through it. And it's a really beautiful story. And like I said, I don't know, Annika and I talked about her height and how that's been a discouragement for her, especially now that she's older and things. She's so kind. She's so talented. And I asked her why she was wanting to tell her story, why she wanted to come on here and say what her past was and where she's at. And she just continues to say,
I think that God is going to use my story in some way, shape, or form, whether that's through singing, whether that's through writing, whether that's through I don't know, doing something or becoming like a professor or something. I don't know. But I just think that there's a reason that I have a story like I do. And there's not a mistake that it's like this. Like, it's not, because God doesn't make mistakes. And so he didn't put me in Russia for no reason. He didn't put me with this wonderful lady here for no reason. And he didn't give me a voice or these writing abilities just for me to throw away and say, I don't need them.
And she goes back and remembers that, like, even when she's singing on stage at youth group, and this is so wise of her.
I'm in my youth band. And sometimes I think, oh my gosh, it's all about me. And then I'm like, wait, hold up, go back. This isn't about me. I'm praising God. He gave me this voice for a reason. Same with my writing. I'm not the one who's writing. It's him that's writing. I didn't create this whole book on my own. I didn't think of the title on my own. I didn't make the characters on my own. And so I think in just everything that I do and that everyone does, that they should always bring glory to God.
And I'm like, Annika, at 15 years old, for you to be thinking in those things and realize and catch yourself in that pride and humbling yourself before the Lord, you are going to go so far. When it's not your ambition, but it's the Lord's ambition, he's going to take you so far. And looking back on all the things of how she got here and Kirsti's decision to be obedient, God has definitely placed a special purpose on Annika's life. And she wouldn't be here without that obedience through her mom's life. Yeah. And that's what I want. I want Kirsti to know how special that is in God's part in her life to allow this. And Annika's overcome so much already. So I just know that it's going to be, it's just good. She's 15. I just can't wait to see all the things. She was really disappointed when she got to do all of her singing and things with We the Kingdom and Stephen Curtis Chapman and Michael Tate, all of them, because there was no like video or camera stuff allowed. Oh, and no. So if you are one of those singers, memory
they have to hold on to.
We need you. If you are Michael Tate, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Plum, or any of the guys, or Katie Nicole from We the Kingdom, Annika would love to sing with you again. You could do it in my basement. But yeah, Annika's story is still spilling. She still has a lot of life left to live. And yeah, Kirsty's just being there for her daughter and doing a great job as a mom.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you got for me?
Oh, man. Okay.
I got through it.
You did great. Okay. No, I'm thinking through all the story, like, one, just expectations in general. I think we can make it so hard on ourselves from just like what we think other people think, or from what we think how we should live a certain way or do a certain thing, or just like thinking, what are other people thinking of us in whatever scenario, situation we're in. So like expectations, man, if it was just easy to push all that out.
Yeah.
Out and away and outside. But it's not. And I think going back to the bit that you said with Aunt Brenda and how like knew that was just like the wisest choice and decision she could do in that moment, considering the circumstances would be to move in with Brenda, and how the Lord provided that. Like in Brenda, and she moved in with Brenda, and they had that time together for finances, all the help that she was with parents passing away, all the help she needed with baby Annika. That just made me think of the story in the Bible in Exodus with Moses. And so I'll just read here in Exodus 17, starting in verse 11. But while Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. Then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. It just made me feel like, reminded me of like whenever we're weak, our friends or those who Christ has put in our lives can help hold us up. And so the story, I was just like, I got to find that in the Bible. Yeah. Like I know when we're weak, one, God is strong. He is there with us. He promises to never leave us, but also he puts us in these spots in our life where we have like brothers and sisters in Christ who will literally hold us up at times, who will be that shelter for us. And so I loved that. I loved hearing that with Brenda.
And it's so side of this as her friend and her sister in Christ. is such a perfect display of how we don't know how those seeds we plant in people's lives early on are going to make a difference. Because had Kirsti not said, hey, Brenda, you know where you're going if you die tomorrow or if you die today. And had Brenda not had a Kirsti way back then, she didn't, little sophomore, obnoxious in Kirsti's words, obnoxious sophomore Kirsti, bugging this dorm advisor about her salvation, about where her hope lied, would change the course of both of their lives. Because without Brenda, I mean, Kirsti didn't have that option of somebody to stay with or help her. The Lord would have provided in different ways, but God knew that Brenda was going to be a big piece of this for Kirsti and for Annika. And so I think that's so special, and just being faithful to don't be shy of telling your friends of the Lord, because you never know, like, you just never know where your paths are going to lead you. And they needed each other to hold each other up. And Brenda with her cancer and all these things, like, just very special.
Yeah.
What else you got?
I think just adoption in general is a beautiful picture of Christianity and like what Jesus has done for us. He's adopted us into this family that we get to be a part of, and all of the yucky and all the messiness that is our lives. Like, he calls us in, calls us his own, takes care of us.
Yes. We all want to be adopted. You know, we're seeking this purpose and this plan for our life. Even when we have earthly parents, like, we're all seeking that purpose. And without God, like, without being adopted into that heavenly family and this inheritance, we can't find our purpose, because our purpose, all of our purposes lie in Christ. And so we all have this deep longing to be adopted and to be saved from whatever our bondage is in life. And so adoption is the perfect example of the Lord saving us and adopting us in as his own. So very special. I just love how obedient Kirsti was through something that she never planned for herself. She never planned for her life. And she did it because the Lord called her to do it, and sought wisdom in it, and walked through something that would be hard for anybody, let alone this young 30-something female. And Annika is such a blessing, and she's such a gift, but I'm very thankful for Kirsti and her obedience.
Amen.
And I'm very thankful for Annika's fun, crazy, sweet life. She's such a joy. Everyone should meet her. I'm going to end this by pulling in a couple things that Kirsti said about Annika.
There are clearly things that Annika's faced and that we faced together that God has protected her. God has made a way for her. And I think I just knew early on, and I continue to pray for opportunities for her to be able to share that her story of complete redemption. It is only by God's redemption and God's plan that she's here today, and that he's brought her through a lot. I think even if you just take the little segments of her life, if you even just look at Russia, all that he did to bring us together and to bring her to the point of being able to be adopted. And I think of her biological mom and the fact that she didn't abort her, that she loved her. She brought her home and she cared for her. And we don't know why she never returned to that apartment. Well, one of the things that I'm amazed at, because this is not me, is her ability to stand up in front of anybody and just share and talk. And sometimes I've tried to not say this recently. Are you nervous? Because she's never nervous. And that's not because of who she is, but because of who he made her to be. And so I've thought for a long time that he's going to use her story in a very powerful way. And it's really cool because so many people will come up to her and say things like that. I can't wait to see how God's going to use you. And he is. But the really cool thing is he is right now. Yeah, like he's using her in the lives of people now.
So
keep singing, Annika.
That is Kirsti and Annika's story. You got anything else for me? Anything?
Not right now.
Okay. Are you ready for
Let's
me to say it? That's the spill.
Thanks for the tea.
We hope your cup was filled by this truth. If you don't want to miss out on anything spilling from us, make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you are listening. Download the episode and leave us a review. It really helps us out. You can follow us on all the socials. Our link tree is in the show notes. We want to thank our spillers from today's episode for sharing their tea with us. Remember that we only share spiritual tea here at the Spiritual Tea Company, and we define that as truth that enlightens others and affirms the Holy Spirit in us. We hope this encouraged you today to spill out your truth onto others of how God is working in your life. To learn more about being a spiller or living a more spill-worthy life, go to our website, spiritualtea.co. That's spiritualtea.co. And don't forget to spill out this episode by sharing it with someone you feel God wants to touch with this story. Stay filled, friends.